Somewhere around July 27th, 1917, servants in Louisville, Kentucky grew accustomed to a peculiar sight that would trouble them for years to come. The world's richest woman, Mary Lily Kenan Flagler Bingham, lying unconscious in a second-floor bedroom during a brutal heat wave that made the entire city feel like it was burning. Her physicians administering morphine with a frequency that troubled the household staff who watched in growing alarm. The injections seemed to come more and more frequently as the hours passed. At 3:10 that afternoon, she died while experiencing violent convulsions that shook her entire body. She was 50 years old, the age when many women were just beginning to enjoy the fruits of their accumulated wealth and status. The vague death certificate listed edema of the brain as the cause, a diagnosis so general it could mean almost anything. 2 months later, on a dark September night, her body was exhumed in the middle of the night under circumstances that seemed designed for maximum secrecy. Armed guards stationed around the gravesite as shovels broke through Wilmington, North Carolina soil. The autopsy results were never released to the public, and to this day remain sealed in archives that few have ever seen. The fortune that killed her had been built by her first husband, a man who co-founded Standard Oil with John D. Rockefeller, and then used those monopoly profits to invent an entire city from nothing but sand, ambition, and an unshakable belief that money could buy anything. Henry Morrison Flagler had constructed a 100,000 square foot marble palace on a barrier island where absolutely nothing had existed before he arrived with his railroad and his vision. He called it Whitehall, a name that suggested both purity and power. The New York Herald, never prone to understatement, called it more wonderful than any palace in Europe, grander and more magnificent than any other private dwelling in the entire world. He gave it to Mary Lily as a wedding present, the kind of gift that made jewelry seem insignificant. 14 years later, she was dead under circumstances suspicious enough to warrant a midnight exhumation, and the marble temple built to prove that oil money could manufacture American royalty stood empty on the shore of Lake Worth, waiting to discover what happens to monuments when everyone they were built for is gone, and the dreams they represented have turned to dust. To understand how America's richest woman came to die under such circumstances, you have to go back to a desolate barrier island where there was nothing but sand, mosquitoes, oppressive heat, and one man's conviction that money could manufacture what bloodlines could not. A winter kingdom for the American elite that would rival anything Europe had ever produced. Before we dive into how one man invented Palm Beach from nothing but railroad tracks, hotel construction, and raw hubris, I would love to know, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments below so we can see where all of you are tuning in from, and if you are fascinated by the darker side of Gilded Age fortunes. The stories of how extreme wealth destroyed the families who accumulated it. Make sure to subscribe so you do not miss our next exploration into America's lost palaces and the people who built them. Now, let us begin where the money began, in a small town in upstate New York where nobody could have predicted what was coming. Hopewell, New York, 1830. Henry Morrison Flagler was born to a Presbyterian minister's family that had nothing to give him but an 8th-grade education, religious instruction, and connections to the Harkness grain business in Ohio that would eventually change everything. His father, Isaac Flagler, was an itinerant preacher whose descendants had immigrated from the German Palatinate region centuries earlier, part of that great wave of German immigration that shaped so much of American religious life. The family moved frequently, following whatever congregation would pay Isaac's modest salary, never staying anywhere long enough to put down real roots. Money was scarce in the Flagler household. Opportunities were scarcer. At 14 years old, Henry left school and went to work for his Harkness relatives in Bellevue, Ohio, earning $5 a month plus room and board, which was considered reasonable compensation for a boy with no skills and limited education. He was good at sales, though. He had a natural talent for understanding what customers wanted and convincing them that he could provide it better than anyone else. Within a few years, his salary had climbed to $400 a month. Extraordinary money for a young man with no formal training, beyond the 8th grade, and no family wealth to support him. In 1852, when he was 22 years old, he married Mary Harkness, a connection that would prove more valuable than any education money could buy. They had 3 children who survived infancy and 1 who did not. Jenny Louise arrived in March of 1855, a healthy baby girl who would grow into a beautiful young woman. Carrie was born in June of 1858 and died 3 years later, before Christmas of 1861, from causes the family never discussed publicly. Harry Harkness, the only son, was born in December of 1870, arriving late in Mary's life when she was already struggling with the respiratory problems that would eventually kill her. The family settled into a comfortable middle-class existence in the grain trade, respectable but unremarkable. The kind of life that left no trace in history books. But Flagler wanted more than comfort and respectability. He wanted the kind of money that changed things, that built things, that made men remember your name long after you were gone, and your children's children had forgotten what you looked like. He tried the salt business in Michigan during the Civil War, when salt prices were high and demand was strong. Salt was essential for preserving food for the Union Army, and Flagler invested everything he had accumulated during his years in the grain trade, mortgaging his future on the belief that the war would continue and salt prices would remain elevated. When the war ended, salt prices collapsed almost overnight. He lost $100,000, a devastating sum that wiped out years of accumulated savings and left him deeply in debt. He returned to Bellevue in 1866, humiliated and broke, and went back to work in the grain business to pay off debts to his stepbrother who had helped finance the salt venture. It was the worst failure of his life, the kind of failure that destroys some men completely. But it taught him lessons about leverage, timing, and the importance of controlling not just production, but distribution, lessons he would apply with devastating effectiveness in the oil business. But the grain trade put him in contact with a young commission agent named John D. Rockefeller, a man as ambitious as Flagler, but with better timing and a clearer vision of where American industry was headed. By the mid-1860s, Cleveland had become the center of America's emerging oil refining industry, drawing ambitious men from across the country. Rockefeller saw the opportunity and left grain for petroleum, convinced that oil would reshape the American economy. He approached Flagler for capital in 1867, knowing that Flagler understood business even if he lacked ready cash. Flagler had no money after the salt disaster, but his stepbrother Stephen V. Harkness did. And Harkness trusted family more than he trusted strangers. Harkness agreed to invest $100,000 in Rockefeller's oil venture on one condition that was not negotiable. Flagler had to be made a partner. Harkness trusted his stepson's business judgment more than he trusted Rockefeller's vision, and he wanted someone watching his investment who had skin in the game. The firm became Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler, 3 names that would become synonymous with American industrial power. 3 years later, in 1870, it incorporated as the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, a name chosen deliberately to suggest reliability and quality. Flagler served as secretary and treasurer, handling the financial and logistical operations. More importantly, he developed the rebate system that would make Standard Oil a monopoly and earn him a reputation as one of the most ruthless businessmen in American history. Flagler's connections in the grain shipping business gave him leverage with railroads that his competitors lacked. He understood how shipping costs determined profit margins, and he knew that railroads would give discounts to companies that could guarantee volume. He negotiated secret agreements that gave Standard Oil rebates on shipping costs, effectively a 15% discount that competitors could not match and often did not even know existed. The railroads agreed because Standard Oil guaranteed volume, and volume meant steady revenue. Competitors went bankrupt because they could not compete with Standard Oil's prices, and they had no idea why they were being undercut so consistently. By 1872, Standard Oil was producing 10,000 barrels per day and leading the American refining industry. By the early 1880s, it controlled roughly 90% of the nation's refineries, a level of market dominance that would be illegal today, but was simply considered good business in the Gilded Age. The New York World called it the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country, and investigative journalists began documenting the company's practices in excruciating detail. Ida Tarbell would later write a devastating exposé that helped turn public opinion against Standard Oil and contributed to its eventual breakup. Flagler and Rockefeller responded to criticism by saying that in a business so large as theirs, some things were likely to be done which they could not approve, and they corrected them as soon as they came to their knowledge. The correction rarely came, and the abuses continued for decades. The money accumulated faster than Flagler knew what to do with it, pouring in from oil refineries across the country. In 1877, he and his family moved to New York City, the nation's commercial center and the place where wealthy men went to display their wealth. They purchased a mansion on Fifth Avenue, the most prestigious address in America. They hired servants and joined the right clubs. But Mary's health was deteriorating in ways that worried the entire family. She suffered from severe bronchitis that worsened each winter in the cold New York climate. The city's coal smoke seemed to aggravate her condition terribly. Her doctors recommended a warm climate, ideally somewhere in the South where she could escape the harsh northern winters. In 1878, Flagler took his wife and family to Florida, to Jacksonville and St. Augustine, where the mild winter weather was supposed to help her lungs and give her relief from the constant coughing that exhausted her. The trip did not go well at all. Accommodations were poor, far below the standards the Flaglers had grown accustomed to in New York. The hotels were run down, the service was inadequate, and the food was mediocre at best. Entertainment was non-existent in these sleepy southern towns. The cities were populated with invalids seeking the same cure Mary was chasing, creating an atmosphere of illness and desperation that Flagler found depressing. Flagler, accustomed to New York's business culture and sophisticated amenities, found the place depressing and backward, a reminder of everything he had worked to escape. He returned north, convinced that Florida was a backwater with no future and no potential for development. Mary's condition continued to decline despite the trip south. The bronchitis worsened steadily. The doctors tried various treatments, but nothing worked for long. On May 18, 1881, she died of tuberculosis at age 47, her lungs finally giving out after years of struggle. She had wanted to return to Florida, had begged to go back to the warm climate where she had felt better. Flagler had refused to take her, unable to stomach another trip to what he considered a primitive wasteland. Whether he felt guilt about this decision, he never said publicly. But Florida would pull at him for the rest of his life, as if the state itself demanded recompense for his refusal to bring his dying wife back to the only place where she had found relief from her suffering. In March of 1889, his eldest daughter, Jenny Louise, died aboard the yacht Oneida off the coast of South Carolina under tragic circumstances that devastated the entire family. She had given birth to a daughter, Marjorie, who survived only a few hours before dying in her mother's arms. Flagler was devastated by the loss of both his daughter and granddaughter in a single day. He commissioned the construction of Memorial Presbyterian Church in St. Augustine to house their tomb, sparing no expense in his grief. It was a magnificent structure, far grander than a simple memorial required, with soaring ceilings and elaborate stained glass windows. The church cost more than many of the hotels Flagler would later build. The church would eventually hold 4 bodies: Jenny, baby Marjorie, Mary Harkness Flagler, and Henry himself. The marble mausoleum he built for his daughter became the place he would one day be buried, far from the marble palace he would build for his third wife on the shores of Lake Worth. In June of 1883, just 2 years after his first wife's death, Henry Flagler married Ida Alice Sherwards, the nurse who had cared for his dying wife during Mary's final terrible months. She was beautiful, socially ambitious, and within a decade would be confined to an asylum for the rest of her life. Ida hosted lavish parties at their New York estate, a property she called Satan's Toe for reasons she never fully explained to anyone. She pushed Flagler into higher social circles, introducing him to New York's elite families who had previously ignored the rough businessman from Ohio. She also encouraged his interest in Florida, which had become more than just a memory of failure for him. She saw opportunity where he had seen only disappointment and primitive conditions. By 1885, Flagler had stepped back from the daily operations of Standard Oil, leaving the management to younger men. The company essentially ran itself by this point, generating millions in annual dividends that required no effort on his part. He began construction on the Hotel Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine, a 540-room resort designed by architects John Carrere and Thomas Hastings, who understood how to create buildings that announced wealth and sophistication. The hotel opened on January 10, 1888, to immediate success, attracting wealthy Northerners who had never considered Florida as a winter destination. Flagler followed it with the Alcazar Hotel in 1887 and purchased the Casa Monica Hotel, renaming it the Cordova Street. Augustine became the winter destination for America's wealthy elite, the place where New York society decamped when the northern weather turned brutal. The hotel solved one problem, but revealed another that Flagler had not anticipated. Wealthy tourists wanted to come to Florida, but there was no easy way to get them there in comfort. The existing railroads were small, disconnected, and inefficient, breaking down frequently and offering uncomfortable accommodations. Trains broke down frequently. Student service was unreliable, and the infrastructure was inadequate for the kind of luxury tourism Flagler envisioned. Flagler began buying them, consolidating ownership. He consolidated the lines, improved the tracks, and extended service south along Florida's east coast toward Miami. What had been a collection of local operations became the Florida East Coast Railway, a system entirely under his control that could deliver wealthy tourists directly to his hotels. While Flagler built his empire in Florida, his wife Ida was unraveling back in New York. Ida's behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. She suffered delusions that terrified the household staff. She claimed to communicate with the spirit world, holding seances in their mansion where she said she spoke with dead relatives. She believed she was being persecuted by invisible enemies who were plotting against her. She became convinced she was engaged to marry the Tsar of Russia, a delusion she clung to despite all evidence to the contrary. By 1895, her condition had deteriorated to the point where doctors declared her legally insane and a danger to herself. Flagler had her institutionalized at a private sanitarium in Pleasantville, New York, where she would receive the best care money could buy. She would remain in an asylum for the rest of her life, outliving her husband by many years, but never seeing him again or understanding why he had abandoned her. Flagler wanted a divorce, but New York law at the time did not recognize insanity as grounds for ending a marriage under any circumstances. He solved this problem the way he solved most problems, with money and political connections that could bend the law to his will. He approached the Florida legislature and arranged for a new law to be passed making insanity a valid reason for divorce in that state. The law was transparently written to benefit Flagler specifically, and everyone knew it. The legislature passed it anyway because Flagler had invested millions in Florida and employed thousands of people. 2 months later, on August 17, 1901, Flagler's divorce from Ida was finalized in a Florida court. He was 71 years old, an age when most men were thinking about retirement rather than remarriage. His son Harry, who had been 11 when his mother Mary died and 13 when his father remarried, never forgave him for what happened to Ida, whom Harry had grown to love. The rift between father and son would never heal, growing wider with each passing year. 10 days after the divorce was finalized, at age 71, Henry Flagler married again. The bride was 34 years old, a North Carolina socialite named Mary Lily Kenan, and the wedding present he gave her would become the most famous private residence in Florida and one of the most expensive homes ever built in America. Mary Lily Kenan had met Henry Flagler in 1891 at a party in Newport, Rhode Island, the summer playground of America's wealthiest families. She was 23, the belle of North Carolina society. He was 61 and still married to Ida Alice, though their marriage was already troubled. The age gap was 38 years, a difference that scandalized polite society, but did not deter Flagler in the slightest. Mary Lily came from a prominent North Carolina family with deep roots in the state's history and politics. She had been educated at Peace College in Raleigh, which was unusual for women of her generation when most women received only basic education at home. She was described by those who knew her as vivacious, beautiful, and accomplished, particularly in music where she excelled at both piano and organ. She was North Carolina's reigning belle, the most sought-after young woman in the state, and she caught the attention of one of the wealthiest men in America, who saw in her everything his previous wives had lacked. It took Flagler a decade to make himself available, but when he did, He did not arrive empty-handed or without proof of his devotion. During their courtship, which lasted from the time his divorce was finalized until their marriage 10 days later, he gave her $2 million worth of jewelry and Standard Oil stock, gifts that made her wealthy in her own right. When they married on August 24, 1901 at Liberty Hall, the Kenan family plantation in Kenansville, North Carolina, he gave her something larger, a promise to build her the finest house he could imagine, a palace that would rival anything in Europe. But first, there was the matter of finding the right location for this palace. Flagler had been extending his railroad and hotel empire steadily southward through Florida over the previous decade. In March of 1893, he visited Palm Beach, a desolate barrier island on Florida's Atlantic coast that most people considered worthless sand. Before his arrival, Palm Beach was mostly sand, mosquitoes, and oppressive heat. The only notable feature was a grove of coconut palms that had grown from coconuts washed ashore after the shipwreck of the Spanish vessel Providencia in 1878. A few fishermen lived there in primitive shacks. A handful of homesteaders had tried to farm the sandy soil with limited success. Flagler stayed 3 days on this desolate island. In that time, he decided exactly what land he wanted and left instructions with his agent, Albert Robert, to purchase it at whatever price necessary. Robert bought property on both sides of Lake Worth, the lagoon separating the barrier island from the mainland. One parcel, Brailsford Point on the eastern shore of the lake, cost Flagler $50,000, an enormous sum for what was essentially undeveloped beachfront. That would be the site of his personal residence. But first, he needed to create a reason for wealthy people to come to this isolated strip of sand in the middle of nowhere. In May of 1893, construction began on the Royal Poinciana Hotel, a project of staggering ambition. The project employed approximately 1,000 workers, many of them brought in from other states because local labor was insufficient. They used 1,400 kegs of nails, 360,000 shingles, 500,000 bricks, 500,000 feet of lumber, 2,400 gallons of paint, 4,000 barrels of lime, 1,200 windows, and 1,800 doors. The scale was enormous for such a remote location with no existing infrastructure. The hotel opened on February 11, 1894, with only 17 guests occupying its 540 rooms spread across 6 floors, a disappointing start that worried the investors. Nightly rates ranged from $6 to $100, astronomical prices for the time that only the very wealthy could afford. The guests came slowly at first, but Flagler had solved the transportation problem that had kept tourists away. 2 months after the hotel opened, the Florida East Coast Railway reached West Palm Beach on the western shore of Lake Worth, bringing tourists directly from the north. In 1895, a railroad bridge was built across the lagoon, allowing guests to arrive directly at the Royal Poinciana's doorstep without having to transfer to boats. The hotel expanded in 1899 and again in 1901 as demand grew beyond all expectations. By then, it housed 1,100 rooms and could accommodate nearly 2,000 guests at the height of the season. The hallway stretched more than 3 miles in total length, creating a building so vast that people got lost inside. Bellhop sometimes delivered messages from the front desk to guest rooms by bicycle. Because walking would have taken too long, the Royal Poinciana became the largest hotel in the world and the largest wooden structure on Earth, a record it would hold for decades. Flagler built a second hotel on the oceanfront portion of the property in January of 1896 to handle the overflow. Originally called the Palm Beach Inn, it was later renamed the Breakers because guests requested rooms down by the breakers, the waves that crashed against the Atlantic shore. Across Lake Worth on the mainland, Flagler created an entire town called West Palm Beach to house the 1,400 seasonal workers required to operate the hotels. He built houses for them, stores where they could shop, churches where they could worship, and schools for their children. He created a complete support infrastructure for his winter kingdom. He had not built a resort in the traditional sense. He had built a class system from scratch, a social hierarchy enforced by geography and economics. The railroad brought the wealthy from the north. The hotels housed them in luxury. And at his command, the cream of American society crowded into this tiny barrier island, as if summoned by royal decree. The season he invented initially running from January through April and later refined to mid-December through late February, gave structure to their migrations and created a social calendar that the wealthy planned their entire year around. Wealthy families planned everything else around Palm Beach. Palm Beach existed because Henry Flagler had decided it should exist. Before him, there was nothing. After him, there was everything that mattered to the American elite. By 1900, Flagler controlled the infrastructure, the accommodations, and the social calendar of Palm Beach. But he himself had no permanent residence on the island where he had created an entire city. That was about to change in spectacular fashion. In July of 1900, surveyors arrived at Brailsford Point on the eastern shore of Lake Worth to begin planning the greatest house America had ever seen. Flagler gave his architects a simple instruction: build me the finest house you can think of, spare no expense, and make it something the world will remember. What they delivered was not a house in any conventional sense. It was a statement that money could manufacture nobility, that American dollars could buy what European aristocrats had inherited through centuries of bloodlines. John Mervyn Carrère and Thomas Hastings had both trained at the École des Beaux Arts in Paris, the most prestigious architectural school in the world, and apprenticed at the prestigious New York firm of McKim, Mead, and White before establishing their own practice. They had designed the Hotel Ponce de Leon and several other buildings in St. Augustine for Flagler, and he trusted their vision completely. They had also designed the New York Public Library and the Fifth Avenue mansion of industrialist Henry Clay Frick, buildings that announced wealth and sophistication. They understood how to make buildings feel important and how to make buildings announce the wealth and power of the men who commissioned them. The style they chose for Whitehall was Beaux Arts, the architectural movement that had become fashionable in America after the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago introduced Americans to European grandeur. But beneath the classical references lay a deliberate symbolic program that few people understood. Carrère and Hastings designed Whitehall as a temple to Apollo, the sun god of classical mythology and the patron of wealth and power. The building faced east, oriented toward the sunrise, where Apollo began his daily journey. The facade featured massive Doric columns, the type traditionally associated with Apollo's temples in ancient Greece. Lion heads adorned the enormous bronze doors, ancient symbols of the sun and divine power. The structure was built on landfill extending into Lake Worth, a subtle reference to Delos, the island birthplace of Apollo in Greek mythology. Even the landscaping was intentional and symbolic. Instead of formal European gardens that would have been expected, Whitehall sat amid a natural coconut palm grove, evoking the bacchanalian environments classically associated with Apollo's worship in ancient times. Every detail announced the same message to those educated enough to read it. This was not merely a house, but a monument to power, a temple for the new American aristocracy that oil money had created. The exterior rose 2 stories above a basement, with an attic above for servants, 100,000 square feet of living space, 75 rooms filled with the finest furnishings money could buy. Brilliant white stucco covered the brick structure, making it gleam in the Florida sun. A red barrel tile roof crowned it in the Spanish style. The central courtyard, open to the sky, followed the pattern of Spanish and Italian palaces where wealthy families had lived for centuries. There were no outbuildings, no subsidiary structures, and deliberately no formal gardens that might suggest the occupants needed to impose order on nature. The natural landscape was meant to suggest that the occupants had transcended the need for such contrivances and existed above normal human concerns. Construction began in the summer of 1900 with hundreds of workers laboring in the Florida heat. The timeline was aggressive, 18 months from groundbreaking to completion, an almost impossible schedule for a building of this size and complexity. The cost was $2.5 million, equivalent to roughly $80 million today, making it one of the most expensive private residences ever built. Flagler paid cash for everything. No mortgage, no loans, no investors to answer to. It was his building, and he intended it to function as the largest private statement in Palm Beach, a monument that would last centuries. The New York firm of Potier and Stymus received the commission to design the interiors with unlimited budget. They decorated the rooms in a succession of historical European styles that suggested centuries of aristocratic breeding. Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI, Italian Renaissance. Francis I. Each period room was furnished and decorated to match its designated era with pieces either purchased from European estates or commissioned from master craftsmen. Carrère and Hastings designed the exterior, the interior layout, and maintained complete control over the marble entrance hall, which they considered the centerpiece of the entire structure. The rest was handed to specialists who understood that they were not decorating a home where people would actually live comfortably. They were manufacturing legitimacy, creating an American palace that would convince the world that oil money was just as good as royal blood. On February 6, 1902, Henry and Mary Lily Flagler moved into Whitehall with great ceremony. It was her wedding present, completed 14 months after their marriage, exactly as Flagler had promised. The building had been finished on schedule, on budget, and exactly as specified down to the smallest detail. What happened inside those 75 rooms over the next 11 years would determine whether money could actually buy what bloodlines had once granted automatically: respect, permanence, and a place in history that death could not erase. The front doors, massive bronze structures that required two men to open, opened onto a marble entrance hall designed to overwhelm anyone who entered and announce the wealth of the owner. The grand staircase, carved from pink and beige marble imported from quarries in Europe, rose through the center of the space in a sweeping curve of breathtaking beauty. That staircase alone cost $2 million, more than most millionaires spent on entire houses, and more than Flagler had spent on his first hotel. The ceiling soared above, trimmed with 24-karat gold that caught the light. Murals covered the upper walls, depicting classical scenes of gods and heroes in the European tradition. 16 fireplaces warmed the house during the rare cold nights, each a work of carved marble and bronze crafted by master artisans brought from Europe. The floors throughout alternated between exotic imported hardwoods from Asia and South America, and more marble from Italy and Greece, depending on the room's function and the impression Flagler wanted to create. The Louis XV-style grand ballroom featured 15 lunette paintings above the doors and windows, alternating between Watteau-style pastoral scenes and Boucher-style compositions featuring cupids and mythological figures. The paintings had been created specifically for Whitehall by artists commissioned for the project and paid enormous sums. Edward F. Caldwell and Company of New York, the finest chandelier makers in America, manufactured the chandeliers, hanging them with baccarat crystals imported from France at great expense. 12 original gilt bronze and crystal sconces surrounded the room, providing additional light for evening entertainments. In 1903, the ballroom hosted the Bal Poudre, a lavish party given in honor of George Washington's birthday that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime, establishing a tradition that would continue throughout the Flaglers' residence at Whitehall and become the social event of the Palm Beach season. The music room held an enormous pipe organ with hundreds of pipes rising to the ceiling, an instrument that cost a fortune and required constant maintenance. The dining room could seat dozens of guests beneath another gilded ceiling decorated with ornate plasterwork that had been created by Italian craftsmen. The library was lined with shelves holding thousands of volumes bound in leather, though whether Flagler actually read extensively is uncertain and seems unlikely given his business schedule. His private office occupied space on the first floor, where he managed his railroad and hotel empire during the winter months when he was in residence. A secretary's office sat adjacent, staffed by assistants who handled correspondence and business matters that required immediate attention. The kitchen and pantry were tucked into the service areas, designed to be completely invisible to guests so they would never have to think about where their food came from. Staff quarters filled the west side of the second floor, housing the army of servants required to keep the house running. 12 guest rooms awaited visitors, each decorated in a different historical style. Additional rooms in the attic housed the servants who traveled with those guests, ensuring that wealthy visitors could maintain their lifestyle and personal staff even while away from home. Private railcar number 91, built in Delaware in 1886 and later updated to Flagler's exact specifications, brought the couple from New York each season in luxury that rivaled the finest hotel. The car featured a lavish drawing room where Flagler could conduct business, a formal dining area for entertaining, private bedrooms with real beds, and bathrooms with running water, all appointed with the finest materials available at any price. Traveling in this car was itself a statement of wealth and power that ordinary people could barely imagine. The period rooms were not references to European history or tributes to past greatness. They were theft, pure and simple. Flagler was buying legitimacy by the square foot, installing it in marble and gold, and inviting America's wealthiest families to witness the purchase and validate his claim to aristocratic status. The marble was in place and would last forever. The gold leaf was applied and gleamed in the sunlight. The period rooms awaited their purpose as stages for social theater. What Flagler had built was less a winter home than a stage for performing wealth, and for the next 11 years, he and Mary Lily would perform the role of American royalty for an audience that had traveled 1,200 miles specifically to watch them do it and compete for their favor. During the Palm Beach season, defined as mid-December through late February, culminating in the annual George Washington Ball at Whitehall, the Flaglers entertained constantly with a schedule that would have exhausted most people. Mary Lily had finally found the stage. Her youth and beauty had prepared her for all her life. Her husband had built her the most expensive theater in America, and she understood her role perfectly and performed it with grace and enthusiasm that never seemed forced. Weekly musical programs filled the music room with professional caliber performances. Mary Lily employed a resident organist at considerable expense and brought in professional artists from New York and Europe to perform for her guests. Opera stars Nellie Melba and Enrico Caruso, the most famous singers in the world, sang for guests in the grand ballroom, their voices filling the gilded space with beauty. Afternoon teas on the south porch overlooking Lake Worth became a fixture of Palm Beach society that no woman of status could afford to miss. An invitation to Whitehall represented the peak social achievement for the entire season, the validation that you had truly arrived. Guests staying at the Royal Poinciana and the Breakers, including John Jacob Astor, members of the Rockefeller and Vanderbilt families, the Duke and Duchess of Manchester, all orbited around Whitehall like planets around the sun, hoping for invitations. Admiral and Mrs. George Dewey visited regularly, the hero of Manila Bay sitting in Flagler's drawing room, discussing naval strategy. Actor Joseph Jefferson, one of the most famous performers in America, performed scenes from his famous plays for invited guests. Woodrow Wilson appeared before he became president, discussing politics and policy with Flagler in the library. Elihu Root, who served as Secretary of State and Senator, attended functions regularly and valued Flagler's political support. The guest list read like a directory of American power and European aristocracy, the people who actually ran the country and the world. They traveled to Palm Beach by private rail car, stayed in Flagler's luxurious hotels, and competed intensely for invitations to his home because being invited to Whitehall meant you had arrived at the absolute pinnacle of American society. 70 workers maintained the grounds year-round, keeping the lawns perfectly trimmed and the coconut palms healthy and beautiful. Approximately 75 more ran the house itself during the season, from kitchen staff to housekeepers to footmen in formal livery. Many of the servants were transported across Lake Worth each day from West Palm Beach, where Flagler had built housing for them that kept them separate from his guests. The logistics required to operate Whitehall during the season rivaled those of a small hotel with hundreds of rooms, but the effect was meant to appear completely effortless to guests who were never supposed to see the work that went into their comfort. The railroad had originally run close to the house, close enough that you could hear the trains. Mary Lily complained about the noise and the smell of coal smoke drifting through the windows and ruining her afternoon teas. In 1903, Flagler relocated the entire railroad bridge and tracks to the north side of the Royal Poinciana Hotel, near where the Flagler Memorial Bridge stands today, at a cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars. He moved an entire railroad line because his wife found it inconvenient, and the smoke bothered her guests. That was the kind of power Standard Oil money could purchase, the power to reshape infrastructure on a whim. Wheeled wicker chairs, pushed by hotel employees in uniform, transported guests between the Royal Poinciana and the Breakers along a specially constructed pine trail that kept them off the sandy roads. A separate palm trail accommodated pedestrians who preferred to walk and enjoy the tropical vegetation. The system allowed the elite to move through Palm Beach without ever encountering the staff or tradespeople who made their comfort possible, maintaining the illusion that wealth created itself. It was social engineering on a physical scale, the built environment enforcing class boundaries that Flagler had literally constructed from sand and money. Mary Lily presided over this manufactured kingdom with grace and enthusiasm that never seemed to flag. She was described by everyone who met her as vivacious, accomplished, charming, the reigning belle of a social order that had not existed 15 years earlier when Palm Beach was just sand and mosquitoes. She hosted with apparent effortlessness. She performed her social duties perfectly. She smiled beneath the gilded ceilings, while her husband sat in his office down the hall, directing an empire that now stretched from St. Augustine all the way to Miami and would soon reach even further to Key West. For 11 winters, Mary Lily perfected the role of hostess at Whitehall, becoming the model that other wealthy women tried to emulate. The marble proved permanence that wood could never provide. The guest proved importance and social validation. But while she orchestrated afternoon teas and evening concerts with perfect precision, her husband was in his office down the hall planning something that engineers across the country said was absolutely impossible. At age 75, when most men were preparing to die, Henry Flagler announced he would build a railroad across open ocean to Key West, a project so ambitious that it seemed like madness. The route would stretch 128 miles through the Florida Keys, requiring bridges across open water and marshland, where engineers insisted no foundation could possibly hold against the forces of nature. Hurricanes had destroyed everything humans had tried to build in the Keys. The project was deemed suicidal by experts who understood the engineering challenges. Flagler, at 75 years old, was completely undeterred by expert opinion or common sense. In 1905, he announced that the Florida East Coast Railway would extend all the way to Key West, no matter what it cost. "It can be done," he said with absolute conviction, "and it will be done whether engineers believe in it or not." The labor force numbered in the thousands at the project's peak. Many were black workers from the South and recent immigrants from Europe, willing to accept brutal conditions for steady wages that supported their families. Others were convict laborers, leased from the state of Florida under a system that allowed private companies to exploit imprisoned men for profit while the state collected fees. The working conditions were absolutely catastrophic and inhumane. Men labored in brutal heat that sometimes reached 110 degrees, wading through shallow water filled with sharks and barracuda while constructing bridges over channels where hurricanes routinely destroyed everything in their path, with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. Disease spread through the work camps with terrifying speed. Malaria killed dozens. Yellow fever outbreaks decimated entire crews. Dysentery was constant. Drownings were common when storms struck without warning and swept men off the bridges they were building. Conservative estimates put the death toll at over 100 workers. The actual number was likely several hundred, possibly over 1,000, but no one kept careful records of how many men died building Flagler's railroad to Key West, because the dead were mostly poor black men and immigrants whose deaths did not matter to anyone with power. In 1906, a massive hurricane tore through the construction zone with devastating force, killing numerous workers whose bodies were never recovered and destroying months of progress in a single day. Entire sections of completed track were washed away as if they had never existed. In 1909, another catastrophic hurricane struck, obliterating sections that had been considered complete and secure, proving that nature was not finished testing Flagler's ambition. Flagler, increasingly frail but obsessed with seeing the project finished before he died, pushed forward with ruthless determination. He monitored construction from his office at Whitehall during the winter months and from New York the rest of the year, demanding progress reports and pushing engineers to work faster. The press called it the Oversea Railroad and the eighth wonder of the world, celebrating the engineering triumph. They rarely mentioned the men who died building it or questioned whether the human cost was worth the result. The project cost tens of millions of dollars, far more than Flagler had originally estimated. The purpose was partly commercial, connecting to Havana trade routes and opening Cuba to American business, and partly pure ego. Flagler wanted to prove it could be done when everyone said it could not. He wanted to bend geography to his will, the same way he had bent the oil industry and Florida's legislature to his purposes. Mary Lily's brother, William Rand Kenan, Jr., served as one of the key engineers on the project, binding the family even further into Flagler's empire and making the railroad a family affair. In January of 1912, after years of brutal work and hundreds of deaths, the railroad finally reached Key West. Flagler, age 82 and barely able to walk, rode his private rail car, number 91, across the ocean to attend the completion ceremony that celebrated his greatest achievement. The trip exhausted him completely, and he nearly collapsed during the ceremony. He returned to Whitehall and spent much of the next year inside the marble palace he had built to prove he could manufacture nobility from oil money. The marble staircase, $2 million of pink and beige stone rising through the center of the entrance hall in sweeping curves, would prove more dangerous than any hurricane that had struck the Keys. May 1913. Henry Flagler, age 83 and increasingly frail, fell down the marble staircase at Whitehall. The details of exactly how it happened were never fully established and remain disputed to this day. Some accounts describe a simple misstep on the polished marble that offered no grip. Others suggest he was using a hidden servant's staircase that allowed him to leave parties unnoticed and return to his bedroom, a feature built into the house to accommodate his age and his limited patience for extended socializing with people he found boring. What is absolutely known is that the man who had bent an entire state to his will and created a city from sand could not survive his own monument to excess. The injuries were severe and catastrophic. At 83, his body simply could not recover from the trauma of the fall. On May 20th, 1913, Henry Morrison Flagler died at Whitehall, in the marble palace he had built for his third wife as a wedding present, meant to last forever. A small funeral service was held in St. Augustine, attended by dignitaries from across the country. He was buried in the Memorial Presbyterian Church mausoleum he had commissioned after his daughter Jenny's death in 1889. Joining his first family in death, the tomb already held 3 bodies: his first wife, Mary Harkness Flagler, his daughter Jenny Louise Flagler Benedict, and his granddaughter Marjorie, who had died hours after birth. Now it held 4. He was buried with his first family, not with Mary Lily, the woman for whom he had built the greatest monument. Mary Lily inherited the bulk of the estate, valued at approximately $100 million in 1913. Conservative estimates suggest this would equal more than $12.5 billion in today's money, though some sources place the figure as high as $170 million in 1913 dollars, depending on how you valued the railroad and real estate. It made her one of the wealthiest women in the entire world. Her husband's son, Harry Harkness Flagler, remained estranged until his own death years later. He would be buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, 1,200 miles away from the Florida Empire he had refused to join, and the father he had never forgiven. The marble Flagler had imported to prove his permanence had become his tombstone, and the man was buried with his first family while his third wife inherited everything he had built. Whitehall sat empty through the entire 1913-14 season for the first time since its completion. The staff waited for instructions that never came. The marble gleamed in the Florida sun with no one to appreciate it. And Mary Lily, at age 46, was now one of the wealthiest women in the world, sitting alone in a vast house built to display her beauty to thousands, contemplating what to do with a fortune that would prove just as dangerous as the staircase that had killed her husband. For 3 long years, Mary Lily Kenan Flagler lived as America's richest widow and one of the most eligible women in the world. She continued all the charitable works her husband had supported during his life: hospitals, churches, schools throughout Florida that bore the Flagler name. She maintained expensive homes in both New York and Florida, traveling between them with her household staff. She spent considerable time in Raleigh, North Carolina, visiting her aunt and uncle, Colonel and Mrs. Thomas S. Kenan, reconnecting with her Southern roots. She took an active and surprisingly competent role in managing the vast Flagler business empire, which included the Florida East Coast Railway, the Florida East Coast Hotel Company, and extensive real estate holdings throughout the entire state of Florida. She proved herself quite capable of managing the fortune her husband had left her. Whitehall reopened for the 1916 season. But something fundamental had changed in ways that everyone noticed. The woman who had once been described as North Carolina's reigning belle, young and full of life, now moved through the marble halls with less certainty and growing sadness. The house was too large for one person to inhabit alone. The memories of entertaining thousands were too recent and too painful. And when Robert Worth Bingham arrived in her life, she mistook desperate loneliness for love. Bingham was a Kentucky lawyer and politician with ambitions that exceeded his means. He came from what was described as a wealthy and respected North Carolina family, though his personal wealth was extremely modest compared to Flagler's enormous fortune. He had been a college friend of Mary Lily's brother, William Rand Kenan, Jr., which gave him access to the family. He and Mary Lily had known each other casually in the 1890s before she married Flagler and became one of the most famous women in America. They had even dated very briefly during that earlier period. His wife had died in an automobile accident, leaving him a widower. He was available, familiar, charming, and Mary Lily was desperately alone in a marble palace built for entertaining hundreds. On November 14, 1916, they married in New York City at the elegant home of Pembroke Jones, a mutual friend from North Carolina society. Before the wedding, Bingham signed a prenuptial agreement formally waiving any rights to the Flagler fortune, a standard precaution for someone marrying into great wealth. On their wedding day, as a gesture of generosity, Mary Lily gave him a certified check for $50,000, an enormous sum, but one she could easily afford. It seemed generous and appropriate for a new husband. It would prove to be just the beginning of what he would extract from this marriage. By December of 1916, just weeks after the wedding, Mary Lily's health began to decline sharply in ways that alarmed everyone around her. She complained of severe chest pains that grew worse each day. Her physicians treated her with morphine, administering the powerful drug with increasing frequency as her condition deteriorated. The household staff grew deeply concerned about the amount of morphine being given to their mistress. In June of 1917, 7 months after her marriage, Mary Lily amended her will in a secret meeting with her lawyers. A secret codicil left Robert Worth Bingham $5 million outright, an absolutely staggering sum. 6 months of marriage. A mysteriously changed will, a husband who had arrived with almost nothing and now stood to inherit a fortune that would make him one of the wealthiest men in Kentucky. On July 27, 1917, during a brutal heat wave in Louisville, Kentucky that made the entire city feel like an oven, Mary Lily died in circumstances that shocked everyone who knew her. The death certificate listed edema of the brain with myocarditis as a contributing cause, diagnoses so vague they meant almost nothing. She was 50 years old, the age when many women were just beginning to enjoy their accumulated wealth. The certificate was deliberately vague in a way that seemed designed to hide rather than reveal. No autopsy was performed initially, despite the suspicious circumstances. Her body was placed in her luxurious private railroad car and transported to Wilmington, North Carolina, where she was buried on July 31st at Oakdale Cemetery in the Kenan family plot. Not with Flagler in his grand mausoleum in St. Augustine, not at Whitehall where she had reigned as queen, with her own family in North Carolina. Far from the marble palace that had consumed so much of her life and brought her such fame. The Kenan family read the Louisville newspapers and grew increasingly suspicious of the entire situation. They learned about the secret codicil that no one had known existed. They calculated the damning timeline: a November marriage, a December health decline, a June will amendment done in secret, a July death. They began to ask hard questions that would not go away quietly, no matter how much pressure was applied. Less than 2 months after Mary Lily's burial, on a moonless September night in 1917, armed guards took positions around her grave at Oakdale Cemetery in a scene that seemed designed for maximum drama. Shovels broke through the soil as the exhumation proceeded. The exhumation had been ordered not by her husband of 10 months, who should have cared, but by her brother-in-law, Graham Kenan, who was married to her sister Sarah and who suspected something terrible had happened. The family's concerns were extremely specific and based on undeniable facts. Mary Lily had been perfectly healthy before the marriage, according to all reports. Her decline had been sudden and inexplicable to everyone who knew her. The morphine had been administered with alarming frequency, perhaps too frequently for someone supposedly suffering from chest pains. The $5 million codicil had been added to the will only weeks before her death in a secret meeting. The death certificate was vague enough to hide absolutely anything, and Robert Worth Bingham stood to inherit a sum that would make him wealthy beyond anything his own family had achieved in generations, giving him an obvious motive. The autopsy was conducted by a distinguished team that included Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler, who were pioneers in the emerging field of forensic toxicology and whose reputations were beyond question. They examined the body with scientific precision. They ran extensive tests using the latest techniques. According to reports that surfaced years later from sources inside the investigation, they found evidence of injected adrenaline that had no medical justification, high levels of morphine far beyond therapeutic doses, and heavy metals including arsenic that had no business being in her body. The results were never officially released to the public despite intense newspaper pressure and have remained sealed for over a century. The newspapers were not so restrained or careful about facts. Headlines across the country spoke of tragic mystery and foul play in sensational language. Some articles stopped just short of using the word murder, but made their suspicions clear. Rumors circulated wildly through Louisville and Wilmington: syphilis, drug addiction, alcoholism, deliberate poisoning. The Kenan family seriously considered contesting the will and the codicil in court, which would have been a massive public scandal. Bingham's lawyers prepared extensive defenses and hired investigators. For months, it appeared that one of the wealthiest estates in America would be fought over in court with accusations of murder hanging over every proceeding and destroying multiple reputations. No charges were ever filed against anyone, despite the autopsy findings. The autopsy found exactly what the family suspected, according to those who saw it. The courts found nothing they could prosecute under the criminal law of the time. The difference between murder and convenient death, it turned out, was not evidence, but the will to prosecute. And without a prosecutor willing to bring charges against a prominent man, the evidence remained locked in sealed reports that have never been fully disclosed to this day. Robert Worth Bingham received his $5 million from the estate with no legal challenges. He used the inheritance to purchase the Louisville Courier-Journal newspaper, a powerful media outlet. The investment proved extraordinarily sound and made him even wealthier. He built a newspaper empire that gave him political influence across Kentucky. In the 1930s, he served as the United States ambassador to England, representing America in London. He lived comfortably until his death many years later, funded entirely by Mary Lily's suspicious bequest that no one could prove was obtained through murder. The remainder of Mary Lily's massive estate, valued at somewhere between $65 and $130 million depending on which appraisal was used and how assets were valued, was distributed to the Kenan family according to the terms of her will. Her siblings and their descendants inherited the fortune that was supposed to establish a dynasty. William Rand Kenan Jr. established the William R. Kenan Jr. Charitable Trust, which became a major benefactor of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he had studied. The Kenan Flagler Business School at UNC bears both names in recognition of the donations. The trust funded major projects at Florida Atlantic University, Sweetbriar College, Princeton University, and the Smithsonian Institution. The money that was supposed to establish a family dynasty instead endowed universities and cultural institutions throughout the South, creating an educational legacy that has outlasted the marble and gold. Mary Lily returned to Whitehall only once after her marriage to Bingham in 1917 as his new bride, a visit that likely contributed significantly to her declining health, given the enormous stress of revisiting the site of her happiest memories and most painful losses. The marble palace built to manufacture American nobility from oil money sat completely empty on the shore of Lake Worth, waiting to discover what happens to monuments when all the people they were built for are gone and the dreams they represented have turned to ash. Mary Lily left Whitehall to her niece Louise Clisby Wise Lewis in her will. Mrs. Lewis kept the smaller and more manageable Flagler house in St. Augustine and sold the marble palace to a group of investors who saw in those 100,000 square feet something other than a monument, to lost love and broken dreams. They saw 300 hotel rooms and the opportunity to profit from the Palm Beach real estate boom that showed no signs of slowing down even during the 1920s. The investors commissioned Carrere and Hastings, the same architects who had designed Whitehall as a wedding present, to design the conversion into a commercial hotel. The irony of hiring the original architects to destroy their masterpiece was apparently lost on everyone involved. By 1925, plans were complete for a massive addition that would transform the private palace into a commercial hotel for paying guests. Construction began shortly after with no regard for historical preservation. The addition was brutal in its efficiency and showed no respect for the original design. A 10-story tower rose on the west side of the original structure, like a concrete tumor. Some sources describe it as 11 stories, depending on how you counted. The final count was somewhere around 250 bedrooms in the new section, though promotional materials claimed 300 total rooms when combined with the repurposed spaces in the original mansion to attract more investors. The construction obliterated significant portions of Flagler's original design with shocking carelessness. His private office, where he had managed an empire, was destroyed completely. The office of his secretary, which had sat adjacent and contained business records, was demolished. The housekeeper's apartment vanished entirely. The west portico, which had provided a grand covered entrance on that side of the building, was torn away to make room for the tower. The kitchen and pantry were converted into hotel offices and a ladies' lounge. Additional offices were added against the north wall, built directly against the breakfast room and dining room. The middle window of the dining room was converted into a door that destroyed the room's symmetry. The cornice and roof were partially removed on the west, north, and south sides to accommodate the new structure. The original mansion spaces that survived the destruction were repurposed for commercial use. The marble entrance hall became a hotel lobby where paying guests checked in. The grand ballroom remained structurally intact, but now hosted paying guests and conventions rather than invited elite. Lounges, card rooms, and a bar occupied spaces where Mary Lily had once hosted world-famous opera singers and cabinet members. Some rooms were converted into luxury suites, trading cynically on the cachet of staying in what had been Henry Flagler's private palace. The Whitehall Hotel opened on New Year's Eve 1927 with great fanfare and celebration. By 1939, it was described as a $4 million building and Palm Beach's second largest hotel after the Breakers. The timing was unfortunate for the investors. In 1925, the Breakers had burned to the ground and been rebuilt from scratch. Reopening in 1926 with updated amenities and modern conveniences that Whitehall could not match. The newly renovated Breakers drew guests away from the Whitehall Hotel with its superior facilities. Then came the hurricanes that devastated South Florida. The 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, one of the deadliest in American history, caused extensive damage to the hotel structure, requiring costly repairs that ate into profits. The building reopened in January of 1930 after months of repairs, but the Great Depression was just beginning to devastate the American economy. By 1934, the hotel was no longer profitable as wealthy guests stopped traveling. It closed its doors. It reopened sporadically over the following decades when the economy improved, but never regained the prominence its investors had envisioned or made significant profits. By the 1950s, the building was deteriorating badly from decades of neglect. The tower addition was structurally unsound and dangerous. The original mansion, though built with the finest materials Flagler's money could purchase, had suffered decades of heavy commercial use and inadequate maintenance that had taken a terrible toll. By 1959, the entire complex was scheduled for demolition. The wrecking permits had been filed with the city. The marble that had cost Flagler $2.5 million would be hauled away as rubble, possibly crushed for fill or sold as salvage to anyone who wanted it. And then Henry Flagler's granddaughter, a woman who had grown up in the shadow of her grandfather's obsessions and her father's resentments, heard about the demolition plan and decided that at least one thing built with Standard Oil money deserved to survive for future generations. Jean Flagler Matthews was Henry Flagler's granddaughter, the daughter of his son, Harry Harkness Flagler, who had been largely estranged from his father for decades and was buried 1,200 miles away from the Florida Empire at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Harry had never involved himself in his father's Florida projects, staying in New York. He had built a successful life in New York, far from Florida, serving as president of the Symphony Society of New York and supporting the arts his father had never cared about. His daughter Jean had inherited his distance from Florida and his resentment of what the fortune had done to their family, but also, apparently, some latent sense that the family legacy ought to be preserved for history. In 1959, she learned that Whitehall was scheduled for complete demolition. She formed a nonprofit corporation called the Henry Morrison Flagler Museum and negotiated the purchase of the entire property from the hotel owners, who were happy to unload the deteriorating building. The building was in terrible condition after decades of commercial use. The 10-story hotel tower loomed over the west side, structurally failing and architecturally incompatible with the original design. John Flagler Matthews hired Architectural Mass of Palm Beach, a respected local firm, to supervise the restoration of the original structure. In May of 1963, demolition instructions were prepared for the ugly hotel tower. That same year, the upper 10 stories of the addition were demolished, exposing the original west wall of the mansion and revealing the full extent of the damage that the hotel conversion had inflicted on Flagler's masterpiece. Flagler's office was gone forever. The west portico was destroyed beyond any hope of reconstruction. The kitchen and pantry had been gutted and reconfigured beyond recognition. Portions of the roof and cornice would need to be reconstructed from old photographs. The restoration philosophy was clear from the beginning. Return Whitehall to its appearance in 1902, as closely as possible given the destruction that had occurred. Many of the original furnishings had been lost or scattered during the hotel years, sold to collectors, or simply thrown away. The solution was to acquire period-appropriate pieces that matched the styles Potier and Steinmetz had originally specified in their detailed plans. The result would not be Flagler's actual furniture that he had touched, but it would be historically accurate to the era and aesthetic he had chosen. The museum opened to the public in 1960, offering tours of the restored spaces. 55 rooms were fully restored and furnished for public viewing, though some sources cite 75 total rooms in the structure, depending on how you counted servants' quarters. The discrepancy likely reflects the difference between total rooms in the building and rooms accessible or fully restored for public viewing. On December 5, 1972, Whitehall was officially designated a National Historic Landmark and added to the National Register of Historic Places, ensuring its preservation. The museum operated successfully for decades, drawing tourists from around the world, but by the early 2000s, it needed additional space for exhibits and programs. On February 4, 2005, the Flagler Kenan Pavilion opened after years of planning. The addition cost $4.5 million and took nearly 4 years to complete from groundbreaking. The 8,100 square foot structure was designed by Jeffrey W. Smith of the Palm Beach-based Smith Architectural Group in the Beaux Arts style to match and complement the original mansion aesthetically. The pavilion was named for both Henry Morrison Flagler and William Rand Kenan Jr., Mary Lily's brother, who had served as Flagler's engineer, friend, and eventually brother-in-law. The featured display in the pavilion is the magnificent railcar number 91, Flagler's private railcar, fully restored to its original glory and displayed so visitors can see exactly how the wealthiest industrialists traveled during the Gilded Age when they owned entire railroad systems. The pavilion also houses a seasonal cafe for visitors and rotating exhibits on Flagler's life, the development of Florida, and the Gilded Age. The museum operates year-round, though some specialized programs run only from October through January during peak tourist season. Guided tours take visitors through the restored rooms, explaining the detailed history of each space and the tragic Flagler family saga. The Whitehall Lecture Series brings experts and authors from around the country to discuss Gilded Age topics, historical events, and local Palm Beach history. A chamber music series continues the tradition Mary Lily established of bringing professional musicians to perform in the house. Local galas and balls are still hosted in the Grand Ballroom, just as they were during the Flagler era, though now the proceeds benefit the museum's preservation efforts rather than simply entertaining the elite. Jean Flagler Matthews did what Henry Flagler's own son, Harry, never attempted or wanted. She preserved what he built for future generations. Whether that preservation honors his vision or simply embalms a failed dream is a question the marble cannot answer, and historians continue to debate. Today, Whitehall stands at 1 Whitehall Way in Palm Beach, a National Historic Landmark open to anyone willing to pay the modest admission fee. The marble gleams in the Florida sun just as it did a century ago. The gold leaf catches the light exactly as Flagler intended. The period rooms display furniture that was never actually Henry Flagler's, but perfectly matches the styles he chose. What the museum preserves is not the life that actually happened inside these walls, but the aspiration that built them and the dream that failed. Henry Flagler built Whitehall to prove that American money could manufacture what European bloodlines had inherited through centuries. He succeeded in constructing the most expensive private residence in the country at that time. He did not succeed in making his family happy or creating a dynasty. His first wife, Mary Harkness, died partly because he refused to take her back to Florida when her health demanded it, and she begged to return. His daughter, Jenny Louise, died in childbirth, prompting him to build a church as grand as a cathedral to house her tomb. His second wife, Ida Alice, was institutionalized when she became inconvenient, spending decades in an asylum while he moved on to a younger bride. His third wife, Mary Lily, died under circumstances suspicious enough to warrant a midnight exhumation and an autopsy, whose results were never released to the public. His son Harry remained estranged for life, refusing any involvement in the Florida Empire and choosing to be buried 1,200 miles from his father, and the hundreds of workers who built the railroad to Key West died in hurricanes and heat, their names lost to history, while the newspapers celebrated the engineering triumph and ignored their sacrifice. What worked was the infrastructure Flagler built. Palm Beach still exists today, still exclusive, still operating on the social calendar Flagler invented over a century ago. The Florida East Coast Railway transformed the entire state, opening the Atlantic coast to development and tourism that continues today and shaped modern Florida. Whitehall survived as a museum, testament to Beaux Arts architecture and Gilded Age excess. The Kenan family used Mary Lily's inherited fortune to fund universities and cultural institutions throughout the South, creating an educational legacy that has outlasted the marble and gold. What failed was everything human about the project. Family unity was destroyed. Mary Lily's safety was compromised. Any pretense that the marble palace created happiness for the people who lived inside it was exposed as a lie. The money bought a building that still stands. It bought a railroad that still runs. It bought a city that still exists. But it could not buy what Flagler wanted most, the automatic respect that European aristocracy inherited through bloodlines, the sense that his family belonged at the top of a social order that would last beyond his lifetime and honor his memory. The marble he installed proved permanent as he intended. The baccarat crystals still hang from the chandeliers. The gold leaf still gleams in the sunlight. But the people are all gone, and the only thing the fortune guaranteed was that someone would be there to count it after he was gone. In Mary Lily's case, they counted it twice, once when she inherited it, and again when her family ordered her body exhumed to discover how she had really died. Whitehall still stands at 1 Whitehall Way in Palm Beach, open to visitors Tuesday through Sunday, a National Historic Landmark where you can walk through period rooms and imagine what it felt like to live inside such expensive ambition. The marble entrance hall remains exactly as Carrere and Hastings designed it over a century ago. The $2 million staircase still rises through the center, the same staircase that killed the man who paid for it. The Grand Ballroom still hosts events, though now they benefit preservation rather than vanity. Railcar number 91 sits in the Flagler Kenan Pavilion, a reminder of how the wealthiest Americans traveled when they owned entire railroad systems and bent states to their will. And if you listen carefully in the empty rooms where Henry and Mary Lily once hosted America's elite, where opera stars sang and cabinet members discussed policy and European nobility mingled with Standard Oil fortunes, you can almost hear what the marble has known from the beginning, that no amount of money can buy what bloodlines once granted, and that the only thing a fortune guarantees is that someone will be there to count it after you are gone.